Welcome back to our next presentation on doctrine of salvation. During last presentation we discussed what we know in history of theology known as Pelagian controversy, involving two thinkers, Pelagius and Augustine. And as you probably remember, Pelagius was teaching that we are born neutral, we are born perfect, we're not born as sinners, and we become sinners by disobedience. Once you are not born sinners, you can become a non-sinner again through the obedience, and you can obey the commandments of God perfectly. Augustine objected to this, and he went to the other extreme, and he said that we are so totally damaged that our works play absolutely no role at all whatsoever. So we'll continue with this. We're going to see how the Catholic Church post this controversy, how they reacted to it and what happened. So this is the theme of today's controversy. So I've got a few diagrams. This presentation we're going to look at few diagrams. Here you see two colors, yellow and Pelagius. So the yellow is represented by Augustine, and I have Play-Doh here, and we're going to play with this Play-Doh during next presentations. And blue is a representation of Pelagius, and blue represents salvation by sanctification, and this yellow represents salvation by justification. So for Pelagius, salvation was by sanctification alone. Obedience, obedience, obedience. You obey the commandments, you fulfill the law, you obey the commandments perfectly. That's how you reach salvation. For Augustine, nothing of the sort. Obedience plays absolutely no role. We are born sinners, and even before we are born, God is choosing whom He is going to save. So this is the teaching of predestination. So we've got radical separation between justification and sanctification. And in my lectures, I would like to use this radical separation as two bookends of Christian soteriology. Remember, soteriology was the teaching that of salvation, the nature and the doctrine of salvation. So we've got two bookmarks, or two bookends, I should say. One is Pelagius and one is Augustine. And they are just at the extreme of understanding of salvation. And in between those two, you've got any kind of expression of Christianity you can think of, and even non-Christians. Majority of all non-Christian religions, they believe in salvation by works. So there will be somewhere on Pelagius' side. And then you've got in between, you've got Jehovah's Witnesses, you've got Mormons, you have everything you can think of, and there are Roman Catholics somewhere in the middle, and there are Adventists also somewhere in the middle between those two extremes. And I wonder which book here on this, which one is an Adventist book, and we're going to work with this. Then we talked about original sin. And remember that I said that original sin, the doctrine of original sin, is a biblical doctrine. There are different versions of original sin, and this is what makes people Roman Catholics, this is what makes people Protestants, this is what makes people Adventists. And the basic definition is consequences of Adam and Eve's sin on them and the rest of humanity. That's what original sin essentially is. If you say we need to reject the doctrine of original sin, you mean that there are no consequences of Adam's sin on humanity whatsoever. Okay? All that we can say is that we reject this or that understanding of original sin. With that in mind, I created another diagram. We're going to see lots of diagrams during this presentation. And this is the original sin diagram. So you can see here that I have taken Augustinian definition of original sin, and we're going to work with it as we go throughout history of Christianity. And the three basic elements, like I said to you during the last presentation, this is a simplistic understanding of Augustinian original sin, but it helps us to visualize what it is really all about. So the first element is guilt of Adam, and that means that we inherit the guilt of his sin. So it basically means, I could compare it, if my friend commits a sin of sorts, not only he is guilty, I am also guilty for his sin. It makes no sense for even biblically speaking, but that's basically what Augustine believed, that we were there with him, with Adam and Eve, as their children. Okay, we're sinning with him, so we are born guilty of what he did. So we are born condemned. And that's why what happens next, we're going to talk about next presentation. And we have inclination to sin. Okay, we're born with bent to sin, not bent to do right, but bent to do sin. And we are born totally depraved or totally unable to do absolutely anything. And you see those crosses here. That means that Pelagius denies all of those. He denies the guilt, he denies inclination to sin. We are born morally perfect, and we're certainly not born totally depraved. Augustine accepts all three. And this is the basic definition of Augustinian definition of original sin. We're going to work with this definition later on. So just coming back to Pelagian understanding of salvation, I've got another diagram here to bring this all together. So for Pelagius, human beings are born completely free and morally neutral. So this is represented by that statement on the left here. And then you've got life without God, and at one stage some people will experience conversion, a moment of conversion. And once you experience conversion, then you understand the commandments of God, you understand the requirements that God wants from you, you live the life of obedience to the commandments of God. And the goal of life is perfect obedience to commandments of God. This is the goal of life according to Pelagius for every Christian, perfect obedience to God's commandments. And then death happens, all right, and you die. So during death you have final judgment. God is actually taking your name and is looking at your name and just weighing you on the scales and seeing how many good things you've done, how many bad things you've done. And God has some kind of a standard that he will measure you according to that standard, and he will make a decision on the basis of that measurement what's going to happen to you, whether you go to heaven or you go to hell. So this is basically Pelagian understanding of salvation. Perfect obedience to the commandments of God. You have to fulfill that goal if you want to go to heaven. So of course Augustine reacted to this. All right. So we have Augustinian diagram here. He believed that God makes decision. This is important now. God makes decision in eternity past who is going to be saved and who is going to be lost. Did you catch this? This is important. God does not make the decision after you are born, after you show up in this world. God makes the decision in eternity past. That means from eternity past, God knows that you will be saved and you will be lost. So that decision is made. So you come to this earth with your destiny predetermined. All right? And at the same time, all human beings are born guilty and not free and unable to cooperate with God. So you've got two strands of humanity living simultaneously at the same time on earth. The first one is life without God. Those people who are haven't known God yet. Okay, this is elected humanity, and here we have non-elected humanity. So let's see what happens to non-elected humanity. They are born guilty. So what is the punishment for being guilty of sin? Punishment is, of course, death. So we've got this non-elected humanity. And by the way, there's no choice. When you are born, you're born to this earth either elected or non-elected. And you cannot skip, you cannot jump the line. You cannot, being non-elected, suddenly you become elected. Or if you are elected, you cannot become non-elected. There's just no choice, no possibility of switching sides. So let's explore first what happens to the non-elected humanity. It's very simple. At the point of death, they are condemned because they're guilty of Augustinian original sin. Okay, and they, even if they experience, like you asked the question last presentation, what happens to those who lived a good life? Well, it doesn't really matter. Even if you lived good life, just you lost. Okay, so you suffer the fruits of original sin. What Adam did, you are condemned for eternity. But what happens to those people who are who are elected? Well, at some point, Augustine believed, at some point they will experience a conversion. Or they may be baptized. Or we're going to explore this next presentation, what the Catholic Church did with this. But let's say that you are an adult and God, because you elected, you have no choice. One day you will experience conversion. There's just no choice in all of this. So what's next after you experience conversion? Just basically live a Christian life. If you elected, your life will be Christian. If you elected, God will give you gift of sanctification, you will do good deeds and so on, you'll be a good person, but nothing that you do can change your destiny. Nothing, okay? So at the point of death, God makes a decision, all those elected go to heaven. So there is no switching sides. Two groups of people on earth. One is elected, which is a smaller group, and bigger group is non-elected, guilty for Adam's sin. So let me explain this once again in another way. I developed this diagram of the boat. So imagine that this boat that you see is a salvation, that God wants to take you to that boat. So you become sinner, and this is represented by those people swimming in there. They were good, but they became sinners, and they recognize that they're sinners. They just like, hey, I'm a sinner, and they cry out to God, please God, save us. That is all from within themselves. They've got this capacity to reach God. This is important. We're going to work with it in a moment. Capacity to reach God. And so what does God do? He gives them 10 commandments, the ladder of the 10 commandments. And those people on their own power swim to that ladder. They climb on their own power. God is right in the boat, encouraging them. Hey, I gave you 10 commandments. You can do it. You can obey. And those people swim to that ladder and climb back on themselves, by themselves. Augustinian boat looks a little bit different. Okay, so humanity is just dead meat. They're just lying face down in the water. They are massa damnata. Remember, it was the damned mess of humanity. But God knows who are His chosen. And God is in the boat, in the ship, and He comes out there and He grabs the people that He chose and He brings them back into the boat. Those people have nothing to do with that. They couldn't cry out to God. They couldn't shout for help. They're not helping God to do this. God just grabs them and brings them into the boat. So those are two different, diametrically opposed understanding of salvation. So what does the Catholic Church do with this? What's happening now? So there's a big discussion following the Pelagian controversy, and people are trying to put this in different configurations and so on, and they're just working with this, and they don't quite know how to do this. But the early thinkers who came after Pelagius and Augustine, they tried to come up with some ideas. They couldn't embrace Pelagius because it seemed to them that this is unbiblical, that there's no consequences of Adam's sin at all for us. But they also couldn't embrace Augustine for one specific reason that we already talked about in a previous presentation. By that stage, by the time Pelagian controversy happened, the church became a mediator between God and humanity. Ordained clergy within the church became a mediator. You needed to be part of the church in order to receive God's grace. So you see, the church wedges itself between God and humanity. You cannot possibly go to God without the mediation of the church. And God cannot possibly reach you without the mediation of the church. We're going to really unpack this in the next presentation. And by the middle of the 3rd century, a saying has developed. It was one of the Christian thinkers who developed this saying, Cyprian. He said, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. In other words, you have to be part of the church if you want to be saved. Salvation is impossible without a visible ministry of the church. Now, what does that do to predestination? It makes predestination meaningless. Because if God chose human beings, if God elected them in eternity past, then what's the role of the church? Okay, that's why the Christian Catholic thinkers could not embrace predestination. Predestination is impossible because of that visible mediation of the church. So they work with those ideas, and they develop several ideas how to combine those two perspectives, Pelagian and the Augustinian perspective. As a result, we have something that is known today as Semi-Pelagianism. And there were two main versions of Semi-Pelagianism, and I like to call them Semi-Pelagianism 1.0 and Semi-Pelagianism 2.0. Okay, so Semi-Pelagianism 1.0 was developed by the Christian thinker by the name John Cassian in the immediate aftermath of Pelagian controversy. So he rejected Augustinian anthropology, that humans are totally bad and the sin of Adam damaged us completely. He also rejected Pelagian anthropology, that we are very good. He kind of embraced something in the middle. He affirmed that we can actually cooperate. So he affirmed moral weakness. He said that when Adam sinned, what happened to humanity was just we developed a moral weakness. We're not totally bad, we're not totally good, we just morally weak. The fall did not damage us that terribly. And he said something interesting. Because of that, we can initiate the process of salvation. So God waits for all human beings to reach to Him. All right? So we have this ability, innate ability in us to reach to God. And therefore we can cooperate with God. Once we reach out to God, God reaches back to us. And God says, okay, I can work with you. Let's work together towards your salvation. Now this version of Semi-Pelagianism 1.0 was rejected and condemned by the Catholic Church during the Council of Orange in 529. They really didn't like it, and they created a different version. I call it Semi-Pelagianism 2.0, but Catholics really do not like this designation. Nobody likes to be called Pelagian, so they would rather prefer to call this Semi-Augustinian rather than Semi-Pelagian. Nevertheless, Semi-Augustinian, Semi-Pelagian, it's a matter of semantics. It really doesn't matter how we call it. I'd like to call it Semi-Pelagianism for a specific reason, that human works still play an important role, as you shall see later on. So, what's the difference between Semi-Pelagianism 1.0 and Semi-Pelagianism 2.0? There's only one difference, and what you see in the middle. They both affirm moral weakness, that the sin of Adam and Eve has not damaged humanity that badly. Okay? But in Semi-Pelagianism 1.0, humans take the initiative. In Semi-Pelagianism 2.0, God takes initiative. So Semi-Pelagianism 2.0 actually moves closer towards Augustinianism, and that's why Catholic thinkers don't like the term Semi-Pelagian. They rather say Semi-Augustinian. And after God reaches to humanity, humanity responds to God. They can cooperate together towards salvation. And how it works, this will be our next presentation. So this is today the official Catholic teaching, okay, that sin of Adam and Eve has damaged us. We are born condemned. They embrace that guilt. That's why baptism is essential. Okay, we're going to talk about this during the next presentation. So the moral weakness is affirmed, okay, but not total damage. We're not totally damaged, like Augustine would say. God initiates the process of salvation. God cooperates with humans towards their salvation. Another way, I suppose, to explain this, that after the fall, Pelagianism would teach that humans are morally healthy, like Adam before the fall. We are morally healthy, nothing wrong with us. We can make good choices or bad choices. Augustinianism teaches that we are morally dead. We have no choice but to be sinners. We have no choice but to sin. And Semi-Pelagianism would say humans are morally sick. So we are morally well, morally dead, or morally sick. And this moral sickness, which is not so bad with us, we are really not that bad, is an official Catholic teaching today. So this is back to the diagram of the bookends. So we've got semi-Pelagianism right in the middle. So the Catholicism, official Catholicism, rejecting John Cassian semi-Pelagianism 1.0, moves a little bit closer towards Augustine, and this is today the official Catholic teaching that the sin has damaged us, but not that bad. We can recover, we can still do things for ourselves as far as the doctrine of salvation. So bottom line is, human beings are not that bad. We're not that bad. Free will was retained. We are not that bad. We can obey God. When God calls us, we have the innate ability to obey Him and obey the 10 Commandments. So we come back to this diagram again. I told you there will be several diagrams here, but this is the last one for this session. Original sin. Augustinian original sin has 3 elements: guilt of Adam, inclination to sin, and total depravity. Pelagius says no to all. No guilt, no inclination, no total depravity. Augustine embraces all of them. Human beings are condemned. Semi-Pelagianism in both versions, 1 and 2, embraces guilt of Adam. Certainly, they believe that we are still guilty of Adam's sin when we are born. They believe that there is inclination of sin to sin, but they reject total depravity. That means we are not as bad. We can still do something with God as we cooperate with Him towards our salvation. So this is, in a nutshell, original sin is consequences of Adam's sin on humanity. And we've got Pelagian version of original sin, we've got Augustinian version of original sin, we've got Protestant version of original sin, we've got Adventist version of original sin. We've got, of course, Catholic version of original sin. So we're going to explore in the next presentation what did Catholics do with that, and how does it work in a practical way for a Christian with these ideas of original sin, human nature, and God's grace. Thank you.